Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. And today we're going to talk about an interesting concept that I got from Jeremy Silman. We talked about Silman's idea of of making sure your plan is both feasible and effective. Now we're going to talk about a different idea that was based on an article that he wrote in Chess Life a while ago. All right, so let's say you're in this position and you're white, and you say, wow, look at that pawn up there guarding g7. If I could just get my queen up there, it'd be mate. Oh, wait a second, I can play queen g1 check, and when he plays king h8, I have queen g7 checkmate. So you do it, you play queen g1 check, and black says, oh, I got a bishop hiding over here on a7. Bet you didn't see that. And he takes off your queen, and you go, oh, no, I didn't see that bishop on a7. Oh, my goodness, I'm lost. I resign. All right, so suppose I'm your instructor, and we go over this game, and you play queen g1 check. And I say to you, I have a suggestion for you for the future. Whenever you're playing in the future, try not to trade your queen for a bishop, because queens are worth more than bishops. And trading a queen for a bishop is a bad idea. What would you say if I said that to you? Well, you might say, Dan, you're not teaching me anything. I knew that queens were worth more than bishops. I didn't put the queen on g1 to trade it for the bishop. I put the queen on g1 because I thought I was checkmating him and I didn't see the bishop over there. So if you want to tell me that I should look around the board and, look for his captures like bishop takes g1, or maybe I should improve my board vision so that I can see that pieces on a7 that move diagonally can capture pieces on g1 when the diagonal's open. Okay, that's going to be helpful, that I need to improve my board vision, or I need to look for his checks, captures, and threats. But to tell me that I shouldn't trade a queen for a bishop, that doesn't make any sense. All right, so what's going on here? Well, this is why Jeremy Silman wrote in his article many years ago. He said, from an instructor's viewpoint, somebody putting their queen on prise is less of a problem than, let's say, somebody trading when they're losing, unnecessarily trading pieces when they're losing. Now, a computer's not going to tell you the same thing. You might be losing a position and you'll be minus 2.5, and if you trade off, it'll still say minus 2.5. Well, if you put your queen on prise, you might be plus 3, and after you put your queen on prise, you might be minus 6. But from an instructor standpoint, and in trying to help people become better players, you have to differentiate between these errors where you put the queen on prise and you didn't mean to do it on purpose, so therefore it's an accidental error, and things where you already know better, things that you know you shouldn't do, and you do them anyway, which Jeremy Silman says are purposeful errors. So for instance, if someone teaches you, when you're head in material, trade pieces but not necessarily pawns, and as a corollary, when you're behind in material, do not trade pieces. Trading pieces, unless you absolutely have to, is really, really hurtful to your position. But then you go out and trade pieces anyway when you're losing. That's not an accident. That's purposeful. You had a choice to trade or not trade. You knew the principle was you shouldn't trade when you're losing, and yet you did it anyway. See, what Jeremy Silman's saying is, we can work on your accidental errors, we can work on your analysis skills, we can work on your board vision, but when you make an accidental error, join the crowd. I mean, none of us are perfect, we don't play like computers. Sometimes we make mistakes. So, but when you know something like don't trade when you're losing, or don't give up the bishop pair for no compensation, and you do those things, then those are purposeful errors, and those are the kind of errors that you should not be making, and there should just be no reason for you to do that. So accidental errors you can cut down on, but purposeful errors you really shouldn't be making at all. Let's look at this idea in a little bit more detail. Let's look at a game one of my students played. I don't remember the exact position, but I'll create a position that's something like it. He had a pawn, and black had pawns maybe something like this. the king here, and maybe a rook here. And we'll create some more pawns on the board. Pawn, 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 king, pawn, pawn. Just for the fun of it, let's take the e-pawns off the board. All right, so my student had a position something like this. And what he did, he had been playing a 45-45 game, and he'd been taking a lot of time, but he still had a fair amount of time on the clock. And now he got into a position like this, and he thought, aha, I know the principle, passed pawns must be pushed. So he pushed the pawn. He played f6. And black played rook f7 to blockade. He brought his king up. Black brought his king up. White says, oh, I can't get my king in the way. He'll take my pawn check. I'll bring my king around. Black brought his king up. White brought his king to e2. And black says, thanks for the pawn. Rook takes f6. Okay, so here white thought he was doing the right thing. He said, passed pawns must be pushed. The problem is, the better principle is passed pawns can be pushed, but you should not push them what I call past their zone of protection. So here, the pawn on f5 is protected by the pawn on g4, and it's also protected by the rook. So it's safe. It's a protected passed pawn. Once it gets pushed past f5 to f6, it becomes what we call an artificially isolated pawn. And now the problem is that the pawn on f6 is much closer to the king on g8 than it is to the guarding king on h1, and therefore black can surround that pawn and win it. So that was an accidental error. White knew the principle, but he didn't know the principle in the more sophisticated form, so he pushed the pawn, and he was losing the pawn. All right, well, that's an accident, and it's a shame because he was playing a higher rated player, and he had a drawn position, and he gave it up by pushing the pawn, and now he's worse. So black took the pawn, rook takes f6, and now it's white's turn, and white played rook takes f6 check. When white played that move, when we were going over the game, I couldn't help but let out a little gasp. When he played rook takes f6, I said, what? And I looked at the clock, and white had played rook takes f6, I think, in like 1 second. So I asked white, I said, why did you play rook takes f6? And he says, well, he took me, so I wanted to take him. You know, he said I was discouraged that I had lost the pawn, and I was just, trading off. And I said, okay, but, you've heard of the principle when you're losing, please don't trade pieces. You want to trade pieces when you're winning, but when you're losing, you don't want to trade pieces. He says, yeah, I didn't really think of that. And I said, how easy is it to win rook and pawn endgames where you're up a pawn like your opponent? And he says, well, I gather from what you're telling me that it's not all that easy. And I said, well, how easy do you think it is to win a king and pawn endgame up a clear pawn after you play rook takes f6? And he says, well, yeah, he won pretty quickly here. So I said, all right, well, yes, pushing the pawn was a mistake, and you shouldn't have done it, but you gave it some thought, and you did it. But you traded rooks in 1 second, and that was actually your worst move of the game, because not only was it a bad move to trade rooks, but you didn't really think about it, and you went right against the principle that you knew that told you not to do that. Let's give the position right now to, let's give these positions to Stockfish, and I'll show you what I mean here. All right, Stockfish. Right now, the position is white has a protected passed pawn. He's up by about 0.18, 0.29, which is not nearly enough to win the game. But once he plays f6, you can see it goes to minus 1.3. Minus 1.3 might be enough to lose the game. Let's make the rest of these moves here. The computer says he should go rook to d7 and then block with the king. We'll just play rook to f7 like we did in the game. King f1. Computer doesn't like that move. King g6. King e2. Rook takes f6. So now we're at +2. But let's see what happens if we trade rooks. We're at +2 for black, -2 actually. Rook takes. All right, so we were at -2. Now we're at -5. And as the computer looks ahead a little bit more, he'll see that black's queening the pawn, so he'll go to about -9. We're up to -7 at 28 ply. I'm sure he's about to see that black's going to get the queen. He's at 28 ply. He's almost at -9 now. There it is, -9 at 28 ply. So already the computer can see that black's going to queen a pawn. So it's true that after white got to this position and black took the pawn, the computer thinks that white might be lost anyway. But the point is, if you're going to give up resistance, you don't want to make it easy for him. And rook and pawn endgames where you're down one pawn are often drawn. Maybe if this one's not drawn, it's still not going to be trivially easy to win. So this is a tremendous example of a purposeful error. And it's a purposeful error that was made very much without thought. White gave no thought about, he was just discouraged about losing the pawn, and he gave no thought about, is it a right idea to trade rooks here? But trading rooks is inexcusable. Losing the pawn was very excusable. He'll learn his lesson. You know, when you get to positions like this, you push this pawn down the board. If you can't support it with anything more than a rook, and there's a rook and a king on the other side, you know, you're going to lose the pawn. That's just a little bit of experience, realizing that, you know, past pawns must be pushed would not apply to this kind of position, because, as I say, it's past its zone of protection. But that's an accidental error. He didn't mean to lose the pawn. He thought he was doing the right thing, and that's how you live and learn. But you don't want to trade the rooks there. Trading the rooks, as I said, I went like, whoa, what are you doing? Now, let's talk about what are some accidental errors. I had a game against my friend Rich Pariseau a few years ago. We were in the late opening, early middle game, and I think we were playing, it wasn't a very slow, I think it was maybe a 30-minute game or something. And I was trying to figure out what I should do. It was an opening that I had just learned, and I didn't know all the ideas. But I got in, you know, past the opening okay. Let me make the board a little bigger. And I was calculating a line where Rich could play a move like knight to d5 or something. And I calculated if he does that, I would trade off the knights, and then I would do some things, and I would be okay. So I calculated it. I did my job. I did not play hope chess. I figured out what I would do if he made the check, capture, or threat. And I went to get a glass of water. When I came back, Rich had played knight d5. So I said, okay, let me double check my analysis. And I did. And to my horror, I figured out that I had made a mistake. That I thought I could just take the knight and be okay. But in fact, there was a line in there where I was losing a pawn. And my position would just collapse. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked. And I couldn't save the game. So I played the line and I lost the pawn and my game was terrible, and I think 5 moves later I resigned. So the question is, what did I learn from that? Well, what I learned is even as a master, I'm human, I make mistakes. So I did all the things that I would normally do to make a safe move. The problem was when I calculated those things, I made a mistake in my calculations, and then that mistake cost me the game dearly. Okay, but that was an accidental error. I didn't purposely not analyze what I was supposed to analyze. I did all the work that I normally do, and that normally works out okay, and I messed up. If you want to hear the kind of work that I do, I have some other videos on my channel where I play out loud against the computer, and you could hear the kind of work that I do. Do I do it perfectly? No. If you go back to those games on my channel where I play out loud against the computer, and you compare what I'm saying out loud to what your engine is analyzing, you're going to see that, I make mistakes in my analysis. And some of the mistakes are small and some of them are larger. And that's the way it goes. I'm human. I'm not rated 3,500. I'm rated in the 2,200s. And at my age, I'm losing rating points by the year, I'm sure. But in any case, I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to do. But I'm human and I make mistakes. Magnus Carlsen's human. He makes mistakes. He makes a lot fewer than I do. But, he won't want to play the computer either. So, when we're doing this, we're doing the best we can. And when we do the best we can and we do all the right things, but we make a mistake, that's an accidental error. Another type of purposeful error that I see all the time is moving pieces twice in the opening or delaying castling. Those are the two most common things my students like to do. They'll sit there and let's do a delay castling. Let's play, sort of a coal system here. And now, let's say bishop e7. And now white could castle. White says, all right, I won't castle. I'll play knight beat e2. And then black says, all right, I'll play c5. And white says, I'll play c3. And black says, I'll play knight c6. And now again, white should castle. If you look below, let me bring up Stockfish again. Stockfish says, number one move, castle. In fact, I tell my students there's a good principle you could use here, which is if you can safely castle, or you can safely play other moves. Let's say there's no tactics in the position like there are right now. There's no tactics for either side. If you can safely castle in the opening, and you have other moves, and you pick any other move at random, let's say we pick queen to e2, or e4, or b3, or, a3, whatever you want to play, the chances that castling will be in the top 2 or 3 moves is extremely high. The chances that that the move you pick, let's say a3 will be in the top 3 moves, are not so high. Let's ask Stockfish what the top 10 moves are here. Stockfish is a3 in the top 10. Yes, it is. a3 is hanging in there at number 8 right now. Number 7. Okay, so a3 is a candidate move, but it's not in the top 3. And when you're in a position like this, you shouldn't have a better idea. You shouldn't make purposeful errors. What you should do is you should just castle. If you castle, then that can't be a big mistake. If you do anything else, you're sort of making a purposeful mistake because the king is the most important piece. Castling is the only move that gets 2 pieces going toward where they want to go. So there's a principle that says, when in doubt, castle kind of thing. And when you don't, if you know that, if people have told you should castle and you don't do it and you play moves like a3 here, then that's a purposeful error. Okay, let's look at another type of purposeful error. Let's say you're playing the same coal system, and instead of playing bishop d3, you play knight e5. And when you play knight e5, you say, okay, my knight on f3 was a nice piece, but on e5, I'm in the middle of the board. I'm guarded by a pawn. I'm attacking some key squares on his side of the board. Okay, so I like my knight better on e5 than I like it on f3. All right, well, this is again an example of a purposeful error. Now, it's not a really big error. Let's see where Stockfish puts knight e5 in the top moves here. All right, Mr. Stockfish. Let's look at the top 10 again. And let's see, is knight e5 in the top 10? Knight e5 does not make the top 10. Okay. Is it a big error? Does it lose a piece? Does it lose a pawn? Does it get you checkmated? Of course not. But it's not in the top 10 moves, knight e5. But you could argue, oh yes, but the knight on e5, it looks so much better than that knight on f3. He's commanding the center there. That knight on e5 is really a strong piece. Okay, but there's lots of principles that move breaks. One is move every piece once before you move any piece twice, unless there's a tactic. Well, you're moving a piece twice, and knight e5 is not a tactic. You're not winning material, you're not checkmating him, you're not preventing a tactic. So there's no reason to move that knight twice now. Another principle you're violating is it's better to take a piece that's doing nothing and get him to do something than it is to take a piece that's doing something and make him do more. So for instance here, the bishop's doing nothing. Putting him on d3 and getting him to do something is better than taking the knight that's really doing something and trying to get him to do more. Another principle is, as we just said, you want to castle as soon as you can to get your most important piece out of the middle. Knight e5 doesn't help you castle. Bishop d3 helps you castle. That's another principle. How about, let's see, you want to castle, you don't want to move pieces twice, you want to take pieces that are doing nothing and make them do something. There's probably even more principles that knight e5 is violating. So when my student does stuff like this, and I ask them why, and they give me a reason, and I say, but don't you remember that Steinitz and Tarish came up with these ideas of moving a piece once before you move a piece twice unless there's a tactic, and they were seconded by Capablanca and Fischer and Kasparov, and now here in 2020, Dan Heisman is saying, yeah, those guys are right. Please don't move the knight to e5. And you say, yeah, I knew all that, but I wanted to go there anyway. I have a name for this kind of mindset, this kind of error. I call this having a better idea, which is you're an intelligent adult. You know that you're not supposed to move pieces twice in the opening. You know that it was said by Tarish and that it was seconded by Fischer and Kasparov and all those guys. And you know that your coach, Dan Heisman, says that they're right, that you should follow what they're trying to teach you. Yet you're even though you're rated 1200 or even 1400 or 1600, you're going to have a better idea than what those guys had. You know that the knight on e5 is what you want to do, so you're going to have a better idea. So having a better idea is another way of saying that you're not only going to make a purposeful error, but you're going to be very cognizant that it's a purposeful error, but you're not going to call it an error. You're going to have a better idea. You're going to consider it not an error. So your idea is better than Steinitz and Tarish and Capablanca and Fischer and Kasparov. Your idea is better. And I tell people, use the wise adult syndrome. The wise adult syndrome is look in the mirror. What do you see? You see an adult, hopefully a wise adult. Well, a wise adult should be enough to know that you're not that good at chess right now. Your rating's not 2400 or 2800. So that tells you, yes, if you have this better idea, all you have to do is look in the mirror and say, hey, that guy in there isn't very good, but, we had Steinitz, who's a world champion, and Lasker, and Capablanca, and Fischer, and Kasparov. These are all really good players, and my coach Dan is trying to help me with that, and he's telling me that when I play knight e5, I shouldn't be doing that. So I shouldn't have a better idea. The wise adult syndrome and the having a better idea error are at odds with one another. The wise adult syndrome should tell you that you shouldn't do stuff like that. The having a better idea is, I'm an adult, I'm not a little kid, I can see the board, I can see that knight e5 is safe, I want to put my knight there, I'm going to do it. Okay? That's what the having the better idea is. So you want to be a wise adult and you want to say, all right, I may be an adult and I may understand things better than little kids do, but that doesn't mean I should violate principles. That means I'm not good enough yet to understand, maybe it looks like knight e5 is the best move on the board here, but I want to understand that I'm good enough that if people are telling me not to do that, I shouldn't do that. Now again, if knight e5 is a tactic, that's a whole different story. I mean, let's do something silly and get the queen and the king forked on that square. So let's play bishop e2, queen d6, castle, queen queen c6, a3, king to d7. Okay, now should white play knight to e5 check? Well, the answer is of course. This is not just moving a piece twice in the opening. The principle is move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Then that's a tactic for either side. In this case, it's a tactic for white. It wins the queen for a knight, so of course you should play knight e5. On the other hand, let's say black plays h6, white castles, black plays g5, white plays c3, and black plays g4. Should you move the knight again? Well, of course you should move the knight again. If you don't move the knight, black's going to have a tactic. What tactic will he have? It'll be a counting tactic. That knight is not on prise. The knight is guarded by a pawn and a bishop, but the knight is worth more than the pawn. It's an AWL attack by black, attack with something worth less. If you don't move the knight, then black has the tactic. He has a counting tactic. The counting tactic is g takes f3, and then when white takes back, black gets a knight, white only gets a pawn. So if you don't move that knight, black has a tactic. So you've got to move the knight to prevent the tactic. So here, if you want to play knight to e5, all right, well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you've got 3 pieces attacking the g-pawn, and you've saved your knight. So that's not an exception. But if you're going to just play knight e5 back here, well, as we saw, the engine didn't think that was a very good move. What are some other examples of purposeful errors? Well, in a sense, playing too fast or playing too slow is a purposeful error. You know, you can look at the clock. If you're playing a game and you know what's happening with regard to the clock, and you're so afraid of making a mistake that you're afraid to make a move, in a sense, that's a purposeful error. You're purposely taking longer than what you should, what's good for you, because you're so afraid to make a mistake that you're making the bigger one of playing too slow. If you play too fast, you can't say, I accidentally made my move in 3 seconds. No, you reached out, you grabbed the piece, you made the move, and you hit the clock. That's a purposeful error. That's not an accident that you're playing too fast. You're choosing to play too fast. That's a purposeful error. How about giving up the bishop pair for no compensation? Suppose white plays d4, e6, c4, knight f6, bishop g5, and black plays, let's say, c5, and white says, I'll play bishop takes f6 here. Okay, well, you're giving up the bishop pair. Black now has 2 bishops and white doesn't. By the way, when I test my students, about 90% of my lower rated students, when I say, what's the bishop pair? They say having 2 bishops, which makes sense because that's what it means in English. But actually, the word having the bishop pair doesn't mean having 2 bishops. It means having the advantage of the bishop pair. The advantage means you have something they don't, and which means you have 2 bishops and they don't. So after white plays the mistake, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, now black has 2 bishops and white doesn't. That's having the advantage of the bishop pair, which we shorten to just saying having the bishop pair. Well, again, that's a mistake here. Having the bishop pair is worth about a half a pawn. Let's ask Stockfish if bishop takes f6 is in the top 10 again. All right, Mr. Stockfish, show me the top 10 moves for white. Bishop f6 is hanging in there at about number 8. But look how terrible it is. -1. White's best move is plus 0.03. If he takes the knight, he's minus 1.09. That means he's losing more than half a pawn. He's losing a whole pawn when he plays bishop takes f6. Now it's down to minus 1.19. Okay, so bishop takes f6, giving up the bishop pair for nothing. When you know the bishop pair is worth something, and you give it up for nothing, here, black didn't even play h6 to ask the bishop where he was going. White just said, I'm just going to take that knight. Now, are there lines where bishops on g5 take knights on f6 and give up the bishop pair and it's perfectly good? Sure. But I picked one where it wasn't because I wanted to show you an example of where giving up the bishop pair is a purposeful error. It's only purposeful if you know that the bishop pair is worth about a half a pawn. Even if you don't know it's worth half a pawn and you know it's worth something, then giving it up for nothing is going to be a purposeful error, and you don't do things like that. Now, suppose you were up a queen. Suppose you take black's queen off the board, and you say, all right, well, you want to trade pieces when you're winning. I'll give up the bishop pair here and play bishop takes knight. Well, that would be perfectly reasonable. You're so far ahead, it's sort of like your football team's ahead 400-0, and you decided not to throw a long pass for a touchdown. You know, you're just going to run out the clock. Okay, well, the strategy is completely different when you're way ahead. If you're up a queen and you want to give up the bishop pair to trade a bishop for a knight, that's perfectly good. But if you're not up the queen, now bishop takes knight is a pretty big mistake. We saw it's a one-pawn mistake. Well, one pawn, that's enough the difference between having an equal game and having a game where you're pretty much losing. All right, if you want to keep the channel helpful and growing, please hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, hit the like button. I think this is my 126th video or so, and hopefully you learned something from each one. We're trying to cover as many improvement ideas as we can. I think we've covered a lot of the basic improvement ideas. If you watched most of the 126 videos and you didn't know a lot at the start, I think you've probably learned a fair amount in those 126 videos, or even if you've only looked at most of them, because we've covered an awful lot of the basic ideas that you want to learn to be an improving chess player. But we're going to have a lot more, hopefully. So hang in there, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.